In today's 21st century classrooms, students are faced with challenges very different from those experienced by their industrial-age parents. Today's students are learning in an information age, an age that is redefining education. For instance, literacy is no longer just about communicating through the written or spoken word. Literacy now encompasses numerous forms of electronic communication that includes cell phones, texting, faxing, instant messaging, emails, and new forms of communication are being added all the time. If today's literacy instruction is to be relevant in this new age of constant change, it needs to be flexible and responsive to the needs of today's students. To complicate matters, students today are not only coming to school at different levels of literacy readiness, they're also coming with different language backgrounds. To respond to the challenges of a relevant literacy curriculum and a diverse student population, many teachers are turning to differentiated instructional strategies. To learn how to best apply differentiation to literacy instruction, we turned to Dr. Carol Ann Tomlinson of the University of Virginia's Curry School of Education. Dr. Tomlinson is one of the foremost experts in differentiation and is the author of numerous books and articles on the subject of differentiated instruction and assessment. Recently, Dr. Tomlinson led a 3-day Best Practices Institute in Differentiation and Literacy on the campus of the University of Virginia. With these videos, you will be a virtual participant in this institute that focuses on an approach to literacy instruction that is relevant and responsive to the needs of today's diverse students. You will also attend breakout sessions led by educators experienced in the classroom application of differentiation. In these sessions, you will learn how to use pre-assessment activities to guide you in differentiating your lessons. You'll see how to use online primary resources to individualize your instruction. And you will learn how combining images and text can make subject matter accessible to more students. In this first video, Dr. Tomlinson will introduce the topic of differentiation and literacy and explain how it is a proactive approach to providing all students access to excellence. And now, Dr. Tomlinson.
Good morning. I'm delighted to have a chance to spend time with you. We're so happy to see your faces. We planned for this for a long time and always wonder if there will be humans in the chairs. And when humans come to sit in the chairs, that's just a real pleasure. My goal today is to sort of help us establish a little bit of common direction in thinking about differentiation in general, hopefully, but certainly thinking about differentiation and literacy for these 3 days together. Okay, again, what I'm hoping we can do today is help you build a framework for thinking in really sort of substantial ways about differentiation. It's a very popular topic these days, as I'm sure you see around you. And in fact, interestingly, it has been a topic that has been of great interest for about 12 years now. And we're not seeing it go anywhere except up. And I think the reason for that is because when we look at the kids in front of us, it's very clear to us that more and more they're just not alike. And I think that issue is not going anywhere. The need to address it is not going anywhere. The question is, what's the best way to do it? And that conversation probably will evolve some. But because there's so much interest, there's a lot of talk about what you do to differentiate. Some of the advice is really excellent, rich, substantial stuff rooted in our knowledge of best practice, and some of it is just prime Twinkie. And what I'd like for us to think about a little bit is what makes good differentiation versus just some sort of gimmicky kind of thing that you add to the classroom. And then, particularly because we have a fairly short time, I want to give you some examples of how differentiation might look, and we're going to do that through some lesson plans. Some of them are longer and more substantial, some of them are shorter pieces, and also through looking at some video clips. And then I want you to have a chance to talk to each other, of course, and ask questions. Some of those questions may be things you came in with, And probably, no doubt, as you go through the day today, you'll generate questions, things that pique your interest or push you further or contradict what you were thinking. So I'll try really hard each of the sessions to have plenty of time where you can ask questions, but also tell you that I taught middle school for 20 years. So I respond to loud noises, rapid movement, jerking body actions, whatever works. And so it's fine to interrupt at any point and ask what you've got in mind. And you really can't offend me. Somebody's worked on that for a lot longer than you will have the chance to do it. So feel free that you can be the devil's advocate. You can say, that just doesn't make any sense to me, and it'll help us have a good conversation. Sometimes when those of us who present on differentiation go into schools, people will say, would you come into my class and differentiate for me? Would you show us how to do it? That's kind of fun to do. It's not a problem to do, but it always seems to me to be a little artificial, because differentiation really arises from knowing a group of people and understanding where they're coming from and what they need. And because I'm tall and I've taught for 100 years, I can usually walk into somebody's second grade classroom and have kind of an interesting session. And just because I'm big and novel, the kids probably aren't going to kill me. And so then the teacher's sense is, oh my gosh, she made that happen and I can't. I didn't really make differentiation happen. I made show and tell happen. I made sort of a little demonstration happen. But I don't know those kids well. And so I'm not responding to them as individuals. I'm just sort of doing a teacher trick kind of thing. This 3-day session that I'm going to do with you is built on the principles of differentiation. I'm not going to start by saying, let me teach you 10 strategies for differentiation. What I'm going to start by saying is, let's talk about what makes differentiation work for kids. A question I get really often by email from principals and teachers: if I differentiate instruction, will my test scores go up? If we differentiate school-wide, will our kids achieve better? And it would save me so much time if I could just push yes, type yes and hit send. But I have to say, there's no magic to the word differentiation. And I see people call something differentiation that's kind of embarrassing. And I see people do stuff that I'd bet you my lunch money is going to help kids because it's so rich and works so well together. So I want us to look at those principles. You have that choice in your classroom too. You can say, here's the stuff about writing and reading that I have to cover, and we're going to do all these skills, and when it's over I can say I covered the skills. Or you can say, I want my kids to understand why writers write and how books teach us about our lives. And in the process of doing that, I want the kids to learn the skills they need to have, and I want them to become proficient at vocabulary, but I want them to go away understanding why this stuff works. What we tend to find, and we're going to talk about this in a variety of settings over the 3 days, when you build stuff on those understandings, it has lots of advantages. And one of those is, if you're new, it helps you get why the stuff matters and how to think about it. It gives you a framework for everything to hang to. I think sometimes it occurs to me that the difference between a kid who's really good in school early on and one who sort of stumbles around is that the one who's really slick has had the opportunity to build frameworks of meaning at home. And so we start throwing little bits of stuff at them. And the kid goes, that's one of these. Ooh, this is like this. This is sort of the way this goes with this thing. And they brought us this sort of like jungle gym that they can hang all this stuff on that we give them. Kids who are stumbling around don't have the jungle gym to hang it on. And we keep throwing these little bits of stuff at them. It just kind of falls in the floor and they don't know how to make sense of it. Same thing's true here. If you're sort of new with differentiation and all we do is throw terms and examples and strategies at you, there's nothing to hook it to. So hopefully by looking at the principles we're going to look at, it gives you a way to attach everything else. On the other hand, if you're really good with differentiation already, or if you have a student in your class who's really quite an adept writer and reader, and you're working with the principles, that's where you make depth happen. That's the way you expand stuff for bright kids. You don't just give them more work to do. You give them work that pushes them deeper in their understanding. So hopefully these principles will acclimate those of you who are new and will continue to challenge the thinking of those of you who are feeling more comfortable with differentiation. You're going to see examples, as I said, and because we kind of understand the population that's likely to be here, we'll give you examples from all different grade levels. We'll use a variety of subjects and disciplines, though I will say that purposely I'm sticking more with literacy here as examples, both reading and writing, because of the focus of the conference. I'm going to try to give you some simpler examples where pretty much everybody in the room could say, yeah, I could add something like that. That's not too bad. I could add that to whatever I do. But I also want to give you some examples that should make your hair stand on end and think, I'm not quite finished yet here, am I? When you see some things that people do that are really artful and kind of way out there. And then a lot of times when we're working, we're going to do, obviously, ways for you to process what I'm asking you to think about. And so when we're doing the presentation and debriefing, I'm going to use a hear, see, share thing so that I'll talk to you, give you things to look at, but also opportunities to talk with each other. And when we do the discussion prompts, I will have differentiated some of those based on your assignment, some of them based on how you learn, some of them based on your experience level, and we'll let you participate with those, and then I'll sort of tell you what my thinking behind them was. And also want you to know that I think as an adult learner, and I think this is good even as a young person, it's good to have an escape option in class. If something's just not working for you or you need something else, is there a place you can go sit in the room and read? Is it okay to write in a journal and tell somebody what you're thinking about? If you're a kid who has to wiggle, is there built-in wiggle time for you so you don't feel like you're going to explode? And is there a time sometimes where you just don't need to work on what the group's working on, but there's something else that's really important for you right then? So let's start for just a minute looking at what this thing called differentiation is. This whole institute is looking at differentiation as it pertains to literacy. What do we do to help a whole bunch of kids continue to grow as readers and writers and users of contemporary technologies as much as we can? So I'm going to ask you to start by thinking a little bit about what you make out of differentiation. I'd be willing to bet you if we could lift the top of your head and look in, we'd find 90 different definitions in this room. We all have a sort of a sense of what we're talking about, but may not be tightly in alignment with each other. And to do that, I'm going to ask you to make a choice about a way to approach defining differentiation. In other words, which of these ways of hatching a definition or an explanation or an illustration works best for you. You might decide that it would be a good thing just to write a definition of differentiation. One of the things we find in research is that if you're a principal, principals often say, or sometimes special ed specialists or differentiation specialists will say, guys, we just got to do better with differentiation. And everybody says, yep, we probably do. And then everybody marches off. And what you find is people's definitions differ pretty significantly. And so you have teachers saying, I do that already. I differentiate already. And principals saying, you gotta differentiate. And teachers saying, if you knew what was going on in my classroom, you'd see that I do this. And the principal saying, we gotta get better. And the trouble is, by everybody's definition, they're right, but there isn't a shared one. So a pretty good thing is just to say, if you really were gonna define differentiation, put it on the wall and say, this is what we mean. What would your definition be? A second possibility is to say, you know what would be really more interesting to me is to think about somebody who's new as a teacher. They might be just out of the university. They might also be somebody who's had a second career coming back to teach, and although they're older, teaching's new to them. Not always too helpful to those people to give them a standard definition that comes out of the dictionary. Maybe a more helpful thing would be to say, you know what? If you went into a differentiated classroom, here's how it would look and here's what you'd see, and here's how that compares and contrasts to a more traditional, sort of typical classroom. Let me just show you illustrations of what the two would look like. And a third possibility would be to kind of hatch a metaphor for differentiation or an analogy. Is it kind of like an orchestra playing, and there's a conductor leading the orchestra, but people are playing with different instruments and playing different parts of the music? What would your analogy or your metaphor or even a logo that you designed for differentiation be? And what I'm going to ask you to do for a couple of minutes, if you will, is to pick one of these columns and then to work without conversation with anybody for just a couple of minutes so that you have time to think and people around you who need quiet can think. Jot down some notes, make some sketches, or if you'd prefer just to think about it, close your eyes and do that, but please don't go to sleep. And then in a couple of minutes, I'll ask you to share what you've been thinking with somebody, and we'll talk about it from there. So pick a column, write or think silently, and be ready to share in just a couple of minutes. How many of you shared in a group where not everybody did the same prompt? Let me see your hands. You were talking with people who didn't do the same thing. Did that create a problem at all? What I did was ask you all to do the same thing, and that is to think about what differentiation means to you, to bring to bear your ideas and experiences through something that defines or makes explicit what you're thinking. You did it 3 ways. But the fact that you did different things didn't matter because the connections were there. You could reach out and see what those connections were. So it's a very small thing, but it's a real important principle of differentiation. You can have your students working on 2 very different books, or some of them working with poetry and some working with a book, or some working with a more complex website and some working with a more scaffolded website. But if they're working around the same understanding, if they're headed in the same direction, the connections are there. And it's actually more interesting to talk with people when you have that little bit of variance sometimes than it is when everybody had to do stuff exactly the same. It expands your thinking a bit. I want to share with you just really briefly the model that I use for doing this. And again, it's pretty simple, but it turns out in research to be pretty powerful. This fellow named Robert Sternberg, who has a theory of multiple intelligences or intelligence preferences that's not as well known as Howard Gardner's, but I think it's got a lot going for it. Sternberg's work suggests to him that we're wired in such a way that some of us really have strengths in what he calls analytical thinking. Some of us have particular strengths in what he calls practical thinking, and some of us have real strengths in what he calls creative thinking. Like Gardner, he reminds us that all of us do all 3 of these things. If we didn't, we couldn't survive. Life calls on you to do all of these. But the trick is that some of us may be particularly comfortable in 1 or 2 of the areas, but not equally comfortable in all 3, although some people may be all 3. Sternberg calls analytical thinking schoolhouse intelligence. It's the typical kind of stuff we do in school. Write the 3-paragraph essay, put these things in order, write a research paper going through these steps, compare and contrast, make a timeline, do the Venn diagram. It's taking things apart and arranging them and sort of seeing how they all string together in logic or in time or something like that. School is particularly advantageous for kids who have analytical smarts, because school is mostly analytical. How many of you chose to do this definition? Let me see your hands. Put them up high and look around. See how many people did that, okay? And you may have had a lot of reasons for doing. That's a lot of you. That's probably half or more of you. You may have done it just because I made the case that having a solid definition is not a bad thing. You may have done it because you think it would be helpful to you in your place to have a definition. But you may have also done it because you're inclined in that direction. I get what that definition thing is. I'm pretty good at that. I know how to lay that out. How many of you did the explain to a teacher? Let me see your hands. Put them up and look around. Maybe a quarter of you did that. That's what, sorry, wrong direction. That's what Sternberg would call practical intelligence. His sort of catchphrase for that is street smarts. It's the person who knows how to get stuff done. It's also the kid who doesn't learn very well out of a textbook, but you show him somebody using that thing, you get him to use whatever it is you're trying to do something, act on something in the world, and he's got it. It's my sort of typical definition, connection for me there is I can read a computer manual all day long where they explain to me how something works, and that stuff just slides off me like crazy. The words don't make sense, the sentences don't come together. But you put me at the computer and show me how to do it and let me do something with it right then, got it. And whether that would be the case for me if I were learning chemistry, I don't know. I might do better out of the book. We're not the same with everything all the time. But a lot of people are just really good at making things happen in the world and using them. Not always as comfortable with just sort of in the abstract, hanging it together. How many of you chose to do the analogy or the metaphor? Well, that's kind of interesting. That's a little unusual. Probably as many as a third of you did that. That's what Sternberg calls creative intelligence. And it's imaginative. It's thinking outside the box. It's looking for another way to envision something or seeing possibilities that somebody else really hasn't seen so much. Here's why I like Sternberg's work. I have a little trouble wrapping my lessons around 8.5 intelligences. If I'm really going to do justice for Gardner, and he's correct, then I should assume that in many of my classes I'd have 8.5 preferences. And if I just stick to 2 or 3 all the time, then I might have been good for those 2 or 3 kids, but I haven't gotten the whole waterfront. And sometimes it's a little weighty for me to try to hack 8.5 different ways to come after something. I think Gardner's work is very useful for a lot of reasons. It's just that sometimes the 8.5 seems a lot to me. I can handle 3. Second thing is, sometimes with Gardner, I have a little difficulty making a particular intelligence work with a particular subject. Trying to do spatial intelligence with Shakespeare is a little tricky. Intrapersonal intelligence in calculus is just sort of out there somehow. But these 3 fit to me all the time. I always see the analytical, the creative, and the practical. And the other thing that's interesting for me is, despite all the publicity Gardner's work has gotten, there's not a huge amount of research on it. There's a little bit, but not just a lot. A lot of work on Sternberg, a lot of research on his, conducted with very young children through college age and adults, with very strong results, suggesting a couple of things. When a teacher teaches in a preference for a kid, achievement tends to go up. And when a teacher makes efforts to teach with all 3 modes in front of the kids all the time, they tend to extend their capacities, and achievement tends to go up. And there's an interesting thing he's found in some of his research that makes sense to me, and that is that often kids that we speak of as having an achievement gap tend to be strong in creative and practical intelligences. And when you look at that, what that often means is people from low-income backgrounds or backgrounds that have been sort of subjugated in some way over a period of time. When you look at African American history, it's a long time where African Americans were forbidden to read. You weren't supposed to read. That gave you too much power. So people didn't necessarily learn to solve difficult problems through books, although some people took the chance and learned anyway, but became very good with creative and practical intelligence, which then becomes part of a culture and kind of a way of looking at the world. And Sternberg finds that when teachers consistently use these 3 options for kids, the achievement gap closes a significant amount, because not that you're going to say all Native Americans are this way or all Caucasians are this way, but rather just having those options so that more people find fit tends to work. It's a pretty good way to do questions at the end of a story, or tasks that you want kids to do to process something they've read. Good way to do writing prompts, to have 3 different writing prompts all going in the same direction, but taking those different approaches. And kids are pretty much like you. They just pick one and then they turn around and talk to somebody about it, and they don't get too worried about whether this kid's your favorite or that kid's your favorite, or whether you think somebody else is more able or less able. It's just choices, pick them and go do it. Let me give you a few thoughts about some definitions of differentiation. This is something a kid drew, actually, and I think it's a wonderful little piece. His mom sent it to me by email as a high school student. This teacher looks to me like such an into-it reader. She really seems to love what she's doing. She's in that book she's reading to the kids. And all the kids are sitting there looking at her so attentively, they actually look like they might even be still for a minute. And what this young man has envisioned is that every head has something different going on in it. The young man who did this used Gardner as a metaphor, and so the little images in the kids' heads represent his intelligence. In other words, if he understood this much, it's suggesting that each kid's processing the information differently. But I can pretty well guarantee you that out here today, some of you all are thinking about what you're going to do when we finish this afternoon. And some of you are thinking that you've got a time zone change last night, and if you'd had another hour of sleep, you'd have been great. And somebody's pondering where to use Sternberg, and the fact that I'm pontificating just doesn't change much of that. And I think it's a nice way of thinking about differentiation. This is kind of a creative definition, sort of a visual sort of thing of how it might work. Here's the stuff I have to teach, but I'd better account for those brains that are going to come at it, going to receive it, going to process it in different ways. In one of my classes this year, we talked about this and talked about what it might mean to say that differentiation is respectful teaching. What does that mean to you? Why would I say that differentiation is respectful teaching?
We're respecting that not everybody learns the same way and has access to the information in the same way.
Yeah, I'm respecting the fact that not only does everybody not learn the same way, but that's okay. You're okay however you are. I like what Catherine says, you know, we've tried to fix lunch so that if you want only meat or no meat, or if you have special dietary things, we want to take care of that. It's a way of saying we understand that you don't all come to us with the same dietary needs, and we'd like to be able to make lunch a good experience for you. And for us, that's a way of saying we care about your particular individuality, not just here are hot dogs and we hope you like them, although a lot of people would. And the same thing's true in a classroom. We understand that you learn differently. Yeah.
And also, respectful teaching is understand that you learn differently, and that your readiness skills are different too. But even though your readiness skill may be lower or higher, the rigor that I'm going to give you in this assignment is going to be within your zone of proximal development. It's going to be high enough that it will challenge you no matter where you are with your readiness.
Yeah, sort of saying we want every kid in here to be challenged today. And we understand that that's not going to mean the same thing for everybody, but it's really sort of not okay if some of you go away not feeling challenged, or if you feel swamped or whatever it is. So to say to you, we're glad that you're here in this room today, we want to try to pitch it for you, means different challenge levels as well as different ways of coming at the material. What else might it mean to say it's respectful teaching? I'm a patient person. What do you think? What else do you make out of that?
Like you said, getting to know your learners, so you take time to get to know them so you know how to target instruction to them.
That it's so hard these days to feel like getting to know the kids is your priority, but kids need that really, really badly. And if I really get to know you, I'm inevitably going to find out you're different. I don't have to acknowledge your differences if I don't get to know you deeply. I can just pretend you're all alike and teach. But if I get to know you deeply, then it's clear to me that you like different things, that your cultural backgrounds vary, that your expectations for school vary. And then I've got two choices. I can say, I see where you're coming from, and I can use that to make things better in here. Or, I see where you're coming from. Don't care, but I see where you're coming from. You sort of have to be able to work with that notion of I see you in order to respect you. And so the getting to know you piece, I think, is a big part of it. After we discussed this for a while in my class this year, a student raised his hand and he said, so if differentiation is respectful teaching, does that mean teaching that's not differentiated is disrespectful? What do you think? Kind of a hard one.
Careless, if not disrespectful.
Yeah, you know, I think that's an interesting point. Careless teaching, or we do a lot of things that are unintentionally thoughtless. I guess it's a sin of omission versus a sin of commission kind of thing. It just doesn't occur to us that it's making all that much difference for kids. But it really actually does for a great number of them. So yeah, I don't think many of us get up in the morning and say, oh, I'd like to go screw up today. How can I do that? But I think that sort of sense of thoughtlessness or just not having pondered it very much or not looking for the implications is probably the case.
My metaphor was of a garden. Like if you have your cactus plant and your fern and you water once a day, the same amount of water for everybody.
Yeah, could kill both of them actually. Yeah, that's a good metaphor. I like that. Yeah.
I think you leave some kids in the dust when you don't do that. You'll have maybe the majority knowing what you're talking about, and then you have 3 kids sitting there like, what? What's going on? So in that respect, yes, it is callous.
Yeah, and I don't think many of us get up and say, I just flat don't care. But we assume that our job is to prepare the lesson and deliver it. And I think for those kids who are going, gosh, I'd do this if I could, I don't have a clue what he's talking about right now. It's sort of like if she'd see me, if he understood, he'd reach out and try to do something here. I can't do it for myself, I don't know how. And then over time, that has a cumulative effect. The comment back here, yeah.
Does your student's comment, though, imply that everything has to be differentiated?
That's a great question, and my answer to that is no. And that's why I'm saying it's artificial for me in some ways to try to differentiate for you. It's nice to show you that strategy, and I'm going to kind of try to keep doing that. But I can't really know you well enough, and in 3 days I can begin to make a few inroads with a few of you, but I just can't get far enough. And so, no, I think you know, in the beginning of the year, even there you start with pre-assessment, try to get a handle on things fairly well. You do what I'm doing, which is to say I've always had a spread in my class before. So even before I know quite who it is, I'm going to give choices to the kids. That'll be a little piece of my pre-assessment. But I don't think you differentiate all day, every day, just for the sake of doing it. You do it when you see there's a need. And when there's no need, heaven's sake, save the time. Yeah.
I think sometimes, too, people don't see the difference between equality and equity, too, within a classroom. Sometimes teacher thinks that, you know, everybody should be equal, everybody gets the same assignment, but they forget that it's the equity in the classroom that we need to have.
Yeah, she said sometimes it's hard for people to distinguish, or we don't think about the difference between equality and equity. I was not born the same height as everybody else, and when I was this height by 6th grade, it was very clear to me that I was different from a lot of the kids. At the same time, I've taught kids who came up to here on me in the 7th grade because they've just had no growth spurt. We see those physical differences, and we accept those, and we provide different clothing sizes for kids. But if we don't see that, just human differences in front of us, we miss the boat there a lot, yeah. And what we're looking for is not trying to make all kids 5'2". What we're trying to do is take every kid, no matter what height, and get them to grow as much as they can from that point. So what we're looking for, to me, and this is sort of my theme song, I guess I probably pulverize it, but is equity of access to excellence. That's what, to me, would make a really good classroom.
As this first video ends, we invite you to consider Sternberg's 3 ways of thinking and how you might use them to differentiate your literacy instruction. In the next video, Dr. Tomlinson will explain why she sees differentiated instruction as a way to shake up her classroom and keep her instruction alive, engaging, and relevant.